Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for A Different World. My name is Rodney J. Morris, and I'm one of the co-hosts of today's session. As you all know, we have been rocked this last year by so many changes and so many different realities that we had never had to face before, including the pandemic and the social unrest that sparked across the nation throughout the summer. Because of that, it's no secret that race right now is a major issue in America. And no matter where you go or who you speak to, we're more conscious of and more divided by issues of race, equity, inclusion, and social justice than we have been in decades. And guess what? The fitness industry is no exception to this. Like many other industries, we do not always know how to talk about race or the things that divide us. In fact, the events of the past summer have rendered many of us afraid, ashamed, flat out exhausted when it comes to openly discussing the topic. That's why today's conversation is not only controversial, but critically essential to enabling our ability to move forward as a people and as an industry. Today's conversation is about facilitating a real dialogue and generating real understanding about the complexities of race and how it impacts all perspectives. White Voices Speak is an exploration of how diversity looks from the other side and how non-people of color can authentically and individually engage in the fight to eliminate discrimination and bias within our industry. It is both a validation of the anxiety that many non-people of color experience when attempting to navigate through issues involving diversity, and a powerful testimony that is intended to replace the racial indifference with communication, collaboration, and commitment. That's why we are so appreciative of today's panelists for their willingness to share their experiences with our industry. Our panelists today, to be clear, are not experts. They're just real people like you and me that love this industry and care deeply about its future. With that, we ask you all to extend us a bit of grace as we attempt to have an honest and open dialogue about something that many of us have yet to have the courage to do. With that, with me today, we have my co-host and A Different World co-founder, Frank Ancharski, Chief Coaching Officer with Club Coach Services, Joella Hopkins, Vice President of Group Fitness for EOS Fitness, Bill McBride, co-founder, president, and CEO for Active Wellness, Lindsay Vastola, founder of Body Project Fitness and Lifestyle, and Catherine Quinn, vice president of customer success with Sneeze It. Thank you, panelists. Let's jump into this and begin. So, everybody, off the cuff, we're having a conversation today about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what really motivated you to agree to be on today's panel? Who'd like to begin?
I'm happy to jump in. After the George Floyd murder and the issue of race became so much more public and prominent, not that it wasn't before, but more people in my industry anyway, in our industry, were talking about it. There were committees and conversations and public statements and all kinds of things happening. And then it kind of seemed to die off a little bit. And the conversation sort of seemed to become a secondary thought, or maybe people who might have been a little more engaged or possibly even performative at the beginning kind of got caught up in other things. And as my daughter likes to say to me, Black lives haven't stopped mattering. And when you mentioned to me that you and Frank were working together to pull this group together and talk about, restart the conversation, I thought I was so grateful, because the conversation stopped being important, it seemed, to a lot of people. So for me, it's just an honor and an opportunity to jump in and keep the conversation going, because it's not something you can put to the side.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to say something, Rodney, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Well, to be honest, this is such a touchy subject, and I think a lot of us get nervous talking about this. Let's just be real. We're executives and we're in high positions, and I did some phone calls this week with some of my very best lifetime friends who happen to be Black, my sisters, literally. And the thing that they said has just resonated is, say something. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to get in there and speak eloquently about the subject, because you're not Black. You're never going to understand being Black. But the worst thing that you can possibly do is just not say anything. And so that was why I agreed to do this, because it is the right thing.
Thanks, Joella.
I'll jump off of that. I think, both to Catherine and Joella's point, it was so prevalent and so part of every conversation, even amid everything else that the world has faced in the last year. It was loud. It was hard to avoid. And then it did just kind of quiet, if you will. It wasn't as loud. And I think for me personally, it was very consuming at the time, because it really challenged, as much as I would like to say that, I am not racist or I don't believe a certain way. It really made me think uncomfortable, like put me very uncomfortable even in my own sort of thought patterns, to do some real deep reflection of, what are my deep rooted beliefs, whether they're beliefs or just things that I'm not even realizing that I'm doing or saying, those around me, how am I raising my children, what things do I have influence in, and just kind of going along with what's comfortable to not keep the conversation going. So for me, this is frankly, it's a challenge to keep that conversation and get out of the comfort, because it's a little more comfortable for me to be on the other side, perhaps, when it does quiet down. So I think that's what motivated and compelled me. Thank you for having it. This is uncomfortable. But I think it's discomfort that's necessary for growth, for an industry and for us as individuals, as a country, kind of in summary, I think.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah, so I guess I go last, or we're going to let Frank go last.
Your honor, sir.
Yeah, so for me, this whole recent Black Lives Matter on this round of exposure socially, to me, what shifted was responsibility. Like, I'm not a racist. I'm not prejudiced. I have these self-identifiers about me being a good guy and doing the right thing, right? But we haven't taken enough responsibility in our industry to not just be passive, but to be proactive. And that leads you down a whole nother path of not only unconscious bias, but similarity bias, right? Like, and similarity bias is simply what? We relate to people similar to us. Human nature, every race, every religion goes through the same thing. It's not a right or wrong. It is a fact of how we're kind of programmed with human nature. So what shifted for me recently, Rodney, is that our industry's done a poor job, worse with race than it has with LGBTQIA, worse with race than it has with women and gender in a lot of ways. And there's lots of reasons we can dive into that affect that aren't necessarily malicious or on purpose. But for me, what resonated to be involved is we have a responsibility as an industry to all come together with all races, with all similarities, with all handicap, with all sexuality, with all of it together to figure out solutions to get rid of inequality. And so that's kind of why I'm here.
Thanks, Bill. Frank.
Well, I think some of you may or may not know about the story how Rodney and I met. And I think for me, as a sports guy, it started all the way back with Colin Kaepernick, even before what happened last summer. And just not knowing what this whole kneeling for the national anthem really meant and how I reacted to that. And then the more it was around college and pro sports, I started really wondering about my own bias and my own prejudice and whether I had any. And so I read this article that you wrote, Rodney, and I like to kid around. I feel like we've become the Brian song of the industry with Gail Sayers and Brian Piccolo. And it just really resonated what you wrote about. And I took a chance. I was fearful, quite honestly, and uncertain about how you'd react to my random email from this white guy from North Carolina, and wondering if you'd ever have any interest in having the conversation like Joella talked about. So we did, and that was in October, and I feel like we're besties already, and now it's become into this panel, and you've been an inspiration in a lot of ways, just the way you carry yourself as a person more than anything. And the fact that we're going down this journey not knowing what it's going to look like. And like a lot of us, I know I'm a little fearful of it, but you've provided a lot of support for that. And the last thing is organically is just us coming together and making it better. And, you know, if you look at pro sports, my wife works for the EPA and they're having training. Corporate America is doing more and more of it. So I just would like to be a part of the solution and not be afraid to talk about it.
That's fantastic. And thank you all. Thank you for the words, Frank. It's mutual. Really have enjoyed our relationship, and I'm excited about what this will become for all of us as we grow. Let's stay with you on this one. Let's just jump right into it. So Frank, you know, from your perspective, you know, why are some white people reluctant or unwilling to talk about race, diversity, and inclusion?
Well, I think there's a fear. And whether you've been around Black or gay, I think there's a legitimate fear, like, I don't want to offend anyone, so I'd rather not say anything. And I don't think, to Joella's point, I think that's the wrong way to be. I think what I have found, and you're a perfect example, and others, like my experience at Lifetime Fitness and also at Active Wellness and other places, is that if you just have the conversation, it's not so terrible. And not be afraid to call out, if you have friends and family, to just ask a question, not even point a finger, but say, why would you say that? Mm-hmm. Why do you believe that? And so I think that's what I would tell you, is that there's a legitimate fear, and I don't think we want to offend anyone. I also think what's made it worse is there's a hypersensitivity with the media and politicians that just give us this, oh, I'd rather not say anything. But I think we're all kind of proactive as it relates to people of color and women and now gay and LGBTQ. It's legitimate inside fear. Mm-hmm. But I hope we all, after today, start helping everyone get a little more courage to just talk.
Thank you for that, Frank. Other perspectives, maybe Bill?
Yeah, I mean, Frank, I love the way you said hypersensitivity. I'm going to take it a little bit around that same topic, self-consciousness. Okay. If I am a white guy in a white guy's industry, which historically that's how the industry started, proud to say that women in leadership and ownership roles have come a long way since the beginning with regard to percentage. But a white guy in what was historically a white guy's industry, and I'm going to talk to you about diversity, feel kind of hypocritical, feel kind of like that's the powerful guy trying to talk about how he wants to share the power. You know, like there's I don't know what it's like to be Black. I don't know what it's like to be gay. I don't know what it's like to be Asian. I don't know what it's like to have a disability. So, you know, who am I to be able to talk, you know, authentically about what we should do and what I think and how I'm empathetic about how others feel. It feels almost like I don't want to be viewed as condescending. I don't want to be used as hypocritical. I don't want to be used as or viewed as somebody thinking they get it when they don't get it because they can't get it, right? So there is a fear there, but it's not a fear of like I'm afraid. It's more like a self-consciousness and hypersensitivity about talking out of turn about something that I really don't have the right to pretend like I've experienced the same way others have. And so I don't know if that makes any sense or if I'm just kind of off on that, but it's more than just fear for me. It's more about, you know, I haven't walked in those shoes.
You know, before we go on to the next question, Rodney, I really want to add to what Bill just said, because I think it'll help the audience. So we have a candidate for panel number 3, really good friend of mine. He's up in Vermont, 2% Black in his town. And he was telling me something that he thought about as he goes into that arena, or when he did 2 years ago. He said, Frank, you know, the one thing about it is you might know how to drink as a person who would go into a bar, but just because you know how to drink doesn't mean you know how to run a bar or be a bartender. And I thought, man, that just gave me a good perspective. And to your point, Bill, you don't have to be Black or gay or anything else to walk in somebody's moccasins. It's about empathy. It's about listening. And And I thought that really resonated with me when he said that.
Mm-hmm. Any other perspectives on why folks may be hesitant or maybe, like you said, hypersensitive, about the topic?
Well, I think that, and I'm going to speak from experience with this one, we can't just go around calling people racist. That's a really harsh word, and nobody wants to think that they're a racist. And the majority of people that may be, they don't even know they are. And that's not the way to approach somebody, by getting in their face and calling them racist. It's only going to make it worse. Mm-hmm. So it's a very delicate subject, and you have to read about the way that you're going to approach other people as a white person, because I'm going to be really candid here as well. White people will say things to you because you're white that they certainly wouldn't say in front of African American people. And we have to have the courage to stand up and, like you said earlier, that it's not okay. You can't say it to me. I don't agree with that. That's not how I feel. And you're going to lose friends over it, or so-called friends. They aren't really friends, if you want me to be honest. But I've been unfriended on Facebook. I've had people roll their eyes at me. I've had people think that just because I didn't feel the way that they did, that, I was going against my own people, per se. I know that sounds really crazy, but that's the reality of this day and age. And we just can't stand by and go with the crowd, if that makes sense. We have to take a stand.
No, absolutely makes sense. Yes, Bill.
Just, Joella, you preach the sermon. I'll turn the pages. I agree exactly with everything you're saying. The quote that comes to mind, though, is a responsibility for not accepting it in your life, is whatever you tolerate, you encourage. So a lot of us have tolerated stuff. We've just simply not said anything, walked away from it, disassociated from people. But whatever you tolerate in your life, you encourage. And one thing about getting older, which I really love, is you get more in tune with what you will and won't accept. And you cut people out of your life that shouldn't be in your life more willingly. You don't worry so much about getting rid of people that don't align with you value-wise. But whatever you tolerate, you accept. And that's part of the problem with the problem.
Mm-hmm. Something you just touched on, Joella, and I think you echoed it too, Bill. How does it start to cross over into experiences with like people who are close to you, like family, for example? Because one of the things that you communicated was, being willing to call these things out and deal with the friction, that may cause. How big is an issue is that for folks? Maybe a lack of confidence to have those conversations with people who are close to them.
It becomes, just maybe to tee off of the last, why is it even, or why are we reluctant to speak about these things, is I think the noise is so loud in the extremes. So especially the media, it's extremes on both sides. So the middle part, where I think most sensible people are, it's not loud enough. So it feels like, I think maybe that's where it's hard to then broach a conversation with somebody who just, we are more aligned in thinking, but we're afraid that we're being lumped in with the extreme. And so the conversation just doesn't happen at all. And I think to the point of, those conversations with those closest to us, Rodney, I think I might've had this conversation, my mom grew up in the South on a farm, where, pre-war, where, it was part of life, to have, the people who helped the farm hands, and you referred to people, you referred to the African Americans a specific way. And that's so deep rooted. And my own mother wouldn't say that she's racist, but in the way that she may refer to somebody sitting at a restaurant, or like these deep rooted things. And to your point, with those people who are closest to you, how do you call them out? How do you change, how do you have those conversations where it's just the fabric of the way that we think and the way we're raised on both sides, or on all sides, I should say, and whatever the matter, whether it's, sexuality or race, it's sifting through those deep rooted lenses that we've been raised in, and then having those conversations that, we won't change perspective. I don't think like it's not my job to change your perspective. I think it's my job, or not my job, but the role I can bring is at least maybe giving you a different look into it, and hope that when they're ready to listen, to understand, and not just listen through their, in acceptance of, okay, yeah, that makes sense, to Joella's point, like just, okay, whatever, and then turn an eye to you. But those conversations are hard. And I think the more you have them, maybe the easier they get, but they're worthwhile.
No, that's an excellent point, Lindsay. I think it actually transitions us really well, into the next question. Thinking about your life, what is one experience that you've had personally, whether in your life or your career, that has greatly impacted how you personally feel about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Lindsay, you can feel free to kick us off if you'd like, or maybe we'll go to Joella.
Sure. I'll just a quick story that I don't think, so I grew up in Hawaii, and which, sounds amazing growing up in Hawaii, but, it was such an interesting, and I was in preschool. So really my whole childhood. And, for anybody who is familiar with Hawaii, there's a term for white people. It's haole. And the word itself means white, translates to white, but there's a deep rooted negative connotation to it. And I remember my very first day of kindergarten when, I get off the bus and, a girl comes up to me, puts her hands around my neck and chokes me and says, you stupid haole, you stupid haole, you stupid haole. And I'm barely 5 years old and I have no idea what haole even means or that it was derogatory, but the feeling that it gave me instilled very deeply, very quickly, very early on that I need to kind of just watch who I'm around, because in essence, I grew up in many ways as a minority in those, in my upbringing, if you will. So even though I had very good friends, very close, authentic friends, and I felt comfortable generally going to places, but there was always it was like a little thing on my shoulder that always said, like, just, do these people really trust you? Or, do you really fit in here? And it wasn't until really recently that I said, if I felt that way growing up, where I always had to sort of double check to see, or it was just a subconscious, not even on a subconscious level, do I fit in here? Can I trust these people? Do these people trust me because I'm different, of a different culture? Is that the way so many people live their lives as a minority, as, gay or lesbian or whatever it may be, in their race, their gender? If that's the way they live their life, does that not hold you back from feeling like you can be your authentic self or reach your full potential in your career? And so that is always, but it was kind of easy. I said, my son will never have to really think those things, or, it just gave me such a different perspective in a way that I think was so deep rooted in my upbringing that I didn't even realize it. Because in many ways it was easy for me to step out of it, when I didn't live there anymore, if that makes sense, but just changed my perspective significantly.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Lindsay. Joella, what about you?
Well, Rodney knows me really well. And for those of you that don't, some of you, Bill, I know you've known me for a while. I don't really march to the beat of anybody else's drum, if that makes sense. I've never been one to just go with the crowd or believe something just because everybody else believes it or doing it. And I experienced racism for the first time really when I was a junior in high school. And I've never been the same since then. And I'll tell you why. I grew up in Iowa City, Iowa, as lily white as you could possibly be. I didn't have one Black person in my entire school. And I didn't know racism. My parents never talked about racism. It just didn't exist in my world. My junior year, my parents decided to move to North Carolina out of the blue. And I now experienced diversity for the first time in a large high school with tons of Black, white, everything you can imagine under the sun. And I was friends with everybody because that's just how I roll. I am that type of person drawn to diversity. Well, apparently that didn't go well in the South when I was growing up. And my basketball coach, my junior year, said, "You will sit on the bench last 4 games of the season, and a new set of friends. By friends, he meant Black people. And it was the day I decided, you know what? It doesn't matter how you're raised. It doesn't matter how you've grown up. Sometimes when you know what's right and wrong and you have a moral compass, you just got to put your big girl panties or your big boy panties on, and you got to do the thing. Well, I sat my butt on the bench the last 4 games of the season. My parents, I had a talk with them. They sent me back to Iowa my last senior year of school because the racism, I would cry about it a day. Like, I just couldn't understand how that could be okay, and people really felt that way. So as a leader and as somebody in the industry, I've taken that route my entire 30-year career. And I've never tolerated that. Always wanted to be around the most diverse teams. And living in Chicago at one point, that was probably one of the highlights of my life, because Chicago is like a melting pot of ethnicities and diversity, races and sexes and all that fun stuff all in one little area. So that's just, how I grew up, and what I saw. I was very privileged. And I didn't realize it until junior year, just how privileged I was and what life is really all about. And, obviously I don't get it and privileged up to this point, but it's time for us to get it, people. It's time for us to get it. So that's just a little bit of history and why I'm the way I am.
Thank you, Joella. Catherine, I believe you had a couple of comments on this point as well.
Yeah. First of all, thanks you guys for sharing those stories. It's always interesting, the journeys that bring people to where they are. I was born in Greenwich Village in Manhattan, raised by activist parents, and we were, in our own humble opinions, as open-minded and, as I said, activist as one could be, marching and, really embraced New York City and everything about it, and moved to DC when we were young. Actually moved to Iowa for a couple of years and then came to DC. And, I thought we had it right. Like, I thought we knew exactly how to be allies, and always stood up for what was right. And I grew up, my father was Catholic, my mother was Jewish. So it was interesting being in the two different worlds and how religion and religious prejudice would take effect. And, my mom would always warn me, when you start hearing, a gay joke or a Black joke, the Jewish joke is next. And as I get older, I thought, why are we even tolerating those first two? And let me be clear, like, my mom wasn't. It was just sort of someone's going to come after you at some point too, right? Got to college and I was invited to participate in a student leadership program. And it was a Black student leadership program. I was one of 2 white kids that were part of the program. And we were telling stories. And one of the gentlemen who grew up in a very upper middle class suburb here in DC told the story about when he was packing to go to college. He had grown up in this house and he was loading his car, and neighbors called the police on him because they thought he was stealing the TV. And it was one of those moments that I thought, just to Joel's point, I thought I got it, right? I had no idea the level of privilege I had, even when I thought I still was fighting, being the Jewish kid, or, it was just that eye-opening moment. And then we hosted a large conference, this Black Student Leadership Conference. Again, there was maybe just a handful of us that were white kids there. And the speaker was, I'm not sure, militant, I think would be the way. There was a lot of anger in his voice, and he had a lot of things to say about there's no way white people can ever be advocates, and he was very homophobic, and it was a very, very uncomfortable moment. And I could feel the tide turn from when everyone, all the students I'd worked with for years were embracing us to starting to turn on us. And I thought it was that moment of realizing the power of who has the microphone. And the power of what happens when you say, no, we're not going to accept that. And we're not going to allow this to continue to happen. And that was the moment I thought, I don't know anything. And I need to take myself out of my reality and start to experience the world from somebody else's eyes and speak up more, because I have a lot less to lose. The journey for me has been that you can never stop learning. There's just, there's no endpoint to this conversation, right? There's never like, okay, I can check off that box. I'm done, working on diversity. It never, ever ends. And so that's why these conversations are so important. Nobody wants to be the jerk. Nobody wants to say the wrong thing. Nobody wants to embarrass themselves, but you've got to get uncomfortable. Otherwise you just can't change and get through it. Change is uncomfortable. And so allowing people to be a little uncomfortable and challenge them. And our responsibility is to speak to other white people or other straight people or other people without disabilities, to advocate for the people who can't advocate, don't have the power to advocate for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's just really really powerful. Like one common denominator, it seems, through every story that you guys have shared is that there was at least one moment that was significant enough to make this whole conversation, not just about race, but diversity in general, it hit your radar in a powerful way where it couldn't be ignored. And that kind of leads me, I think, into the next question, because in order for folks to really start to embrace and evolve, to become active, as you said, allies, there has to be a moment of I think, great self-awareness. So how can someone start to identify if they have an unconscious bias, related to race? Where do they start? Lindsay, you care to kick us off with that?
Sure. During all of this, I don't know if you guys have read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I feel like it's on all of our shelves, and it's one book. It's tattered, it's close by, and I happened to pick it up really kind of through this. I was rereading it, and he came across, or it was the section talking about true listening, like what listening really means. And he went through like the different types of listening. There's sort of like, you just listen, like you listen to, like I listen to my 4-year-old and you go, yeah, and you just kind of play along. There's, listening from sympathy, and that's not I don't think that's the answer here, because sympathy creates a power, like it creates a dynamic, right? A separation. And it's really about listening. And I think now the word empathy is even thrown around in a way that, do we really understand what empathy really means and looks like? And he just does such a great job of explaining it. It's like, it's really listening to understand. It's not listening to answer a question. It's not listening to have a response. And I found, back to your earlier question, Rodney, of how do you have these conversations with people close to you when they're coming, it's sort of like the, we're all free. All you have to do is just respect police officers, and they're gonna, and it'll be fine. Well, no, because I think I said that probably at one time too. We're in a free country. We all have equal access to everything. We have free speech. We can go to college. We can live our dreams. But the reality is that that's not the same reality for everybody. And if we just listen to understand the lens that so many people are looking through life, and we really just not to give an answer or response to, like, but you can go to college and you can live your dreams. And if you just respect the police officer, then everything's going to be fine. And that's not the reality. But if we continue to have these conversations with these preconceived and predetermined responses to things, it's not going to further the question. And I think it really made me, for as empathetic a person and as emotionally intelligent as I would like to think that I am, it really gave me pause in how I am hearing. All full honesty, it was, when I heard Black Lives Matter, a lot of how I heard Black Lives Matter was kind of through the lens of, but nobody else's lives matter. I don't know how else to explain that, but it's really not. And I didn't really come to that until I listened and I heard it in a different way from people that I think I talked earlier, like they're not the loud extremes. They're not the militant person, Catherine, you're talking about, or the extremist white, voice. It was like everyday people who are just have the courage to share what their everyday life is, for me to really listen and hear that that's not what it really meant. So I think if we really challenge ourselves to listen from a place of understanding, this is a silly example, but I always think of it's like a man will never understand what it's like to have a baby. And so, but he can try to understand and he can just listen, right? I am never going to really understand what it's like to be, a Black woman in America or a gay man in America. But if I just listen to understand and not to give excuses or reasons or how you can go above, everything, because we're in an equal country. I really had to kind of put myself in check in those conversations. And I think the more we do that, the closer we'll get to being able to more comfortably have those scenarios and conversations.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's fantastic. Actually, as you say that, Lindsay, it definitely brought me back to a point that Bill was articulating earlier, just around the difficulty with maybe the hypersensitivity and the apprehension, because you're right, the tone and the intention behind the message, if it's not checked, it definitely can be read, negatively by someone that you're interacting with. So really great to see those two things connect. Other perspectives on this question?
I just want to kind of jump in on something that Lindsay was just saying, which was, when you talk about listening, I had this moment years ago when I was at an industry leadership event, and I walked in the room and I said, wow, there are a lot of white men here. And that was all that was there. It was all white men, and it was a big room. And I thought, these are the only voices we hear. And years ago, I had this sort of realization of, in my world, like I consider myself to have a diverse group of friends, and I try to be open to all different kinds of voices through music, through literature, through social media. And I went through one day and looked at my social media feed, and I'm like, it is pretty white. So I made an active decision to start following people of color, all different kinds of perspectives. And it absolutely changed the way I looked at the world, because it to Lindsay's point, when you can hear something from someone else's perspective, you have a different opinion. Even if I think I've been an advocate and I've been, doing everything I can to help, further conversation and be an ally for people, I will never know what it's like to be a Black woman. But what I can do is say, are you listening to this voice? Because this is the voice that matters, and make sure that those voices get elevated where maybe somebody else isn't help elevating.
Great. Bill, I think you were attempting to say something earlier, but may have fallen victim to the deadly mute button.
No, it's okay. That was well worth listening to right there. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, transformational thinking is kind of something of interest to me that I've done a little bit of learning in, and as probably everybody on the panel. But we all have a story that we've created about ourselves, and we all have a story that we create about other people, and we throw around labels. And sometimes white people look at Blacks as victims, and sometimes white people look at themselves as the villain. And so nobody wants to be a villain, and nobody wants to be a victim. Mm-hmm. And so, but we use these labels, and we create this story, and if one event happens in our youth and we make a decision that now we're afraid of that, or we're angry at that, and then we create these stories that, are based on just made up stuff, If my boss walks by me and doesn't say hello, I might go, she's mad at me. I'm probably going to get fired. God, I must have screwed that project up. I'll make up all that stuff up. I don't know what happened. All I know is my boss walked by with me and didn't say hello. That's all I know. But I'll make up this story that could be totally ridiculous. And we make up these stories in our life, and we make up these stories about other people in our lives. And then we live those out as if it's based on some kind of fact pattern that usually doesn't exist. And so I think part of the thing about this empathy and this kind of thing for us, speaking as a white person, is you don't know what you don't know. You only know the stories that you've made up based on your experiences. And so when you talk about Covey, which I've read that book more times than I can count, and everything else Stephen Covey's written, seek first to understand before trying to be understood. don't come to me with your interpretation of the situation. Listen to me from my perspective first. And Covey was very good about that. And anyway, I just think that the stories we all create, Blacks, Asians, Hawaiians, Jews, Catholics, whites, we all create stories.
Yeah, really.
Just to wrap, if I may, from that perspective, in all of the kind of in the height of the summer, a friend of mine who is he's a Black gentleman who's in the fitness industry, and he was very vocal throughout it, but he gave such perspective because he would say, white people, we're not mad at you. We just want you to understand us. And likewise, we probably don't understand you. And immediately it was like, it gave me space that, you know what, as much as I don't understand you, maybe you don't understand our perspective either. And if we could both come to the place that we can seek to understand each other first, I think that was huge. Like for me, that was an eye opener. It gave me space to say, like, you know what, like, I know I have some growth to do. We all do. But it was just an interesting, and to your, the villain victim, I think it equalized the dynamic for me. And I thought that was a very powerful moment for me.
Well, and there's also experiences of racism from other groups besides white people. It manifests itself differently because white people control a lot of the influence on what we're calling prejudicial behavior, right? Where we're discriminating and we're controlling things and not giving access to other groups. But I'm a big Muhammad Ali fan. I mean, I thought Muhammad Ali, I think he's, just the dynamic charisma and athleticism, but he was very much in some parts of his life, very separate about the races and his views. So, it's not just white people, it's all people have to look at the stories that they've created. Because we've got to meet on common ground to get each other. I know where you're coming from. You know where I'm coming from. We both want this to be great and better and fair and right and just,
Can I just jump in on that? Sorry. I don't know if I'm touching the third rail here, but I think maybe that's part of the point of the conversation I feel like we're talking about two things here, though, right? There's prejudice and bigotry, and then there's racism. And kind of going back to that Black Student Leadership Conference I participated in college, a mentor at the time, he's like, to break it down easily for you, Catherine, he's like, the ism is the power, right? And so there's a difference between recognizing racism and being anti-racist with regards to power and privilege and those things, and then also having conversations and understanding prejudices and bigotry. Those two things are so tightly interwoven, but they are different. And I think it's an important distinction to make because, so much of the conversation from the past, it's not like just the past year. I mean, this is a conversation, my parents marched in the 60s, right? I mean, this is not a new thing. It's the same old conversation. But I like that the conversation is sprinkling out into new communities and white people are realizing we have to speak up and we have to get more involved and we have to be actively anti-racist if this ever is going to change. And so just sharing that thought that I think having those two conversations are critically and equally important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an incredible point. And just to kind of not paraphrase, but what I'm hearing you say, and it's funny, I went back to relationship counseling from way back in the day, right? And one of the strategies that you learn is that, they have to have two willing participants, right, to communicate. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, in order for effective communication to take place, only one of the two people really needs to be focused on making a positive outcome. And one of the things that comes up is there are oftentimes conflict in relationships when both partners feel as though they're only willing to engage or they're only willing to participate if the other partner is willing to also admit their own fault or their own error, right? And that perpetuates this cycle where no one's really fully willing to share completely in the responsibility, in the situation. And that becomes one of the critical reasons why progress is not made, right? So what I'm hearing you drawing out is in this conversation between racism and prejudice and discrimination, this maybe isn't one of those situations where it's got to be a 50-50. And if we're willing and really want to move something forward, someone's got to be willing to say, I'm going to take ownership, I'm going to take responsibility and continue to move forward. So in that light, I think let's talk about, what leaders, and specifically white leaders, in the fitness industry can do to become advocates and allies for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And before you all answer, this conversation isn't just about race. Equity and inclusion and diversity is a much broader spectrum. So feel free to respond, in terms of any other group that you particularly have a passion to advocate for.
Rodney, I'll go ahead and kick us off. And I talked to you about this ahead of time, and I've been purposely quiet because I've been working on the courage to talk about it. And so what I want to just ask the audience for ahead of time is, and we almost always think about it being a black and white thing, but there's so many other things, and we just started touching on it as it relates to religion, as it relates to nationality. And believe me, the butt of any jokes usually starts with Polish. But that's not what I really want to start off with, because you guys can make fun of us because we laugh easy. What I do want to talk about, though, is recently somebody in my family came out gay. And the emotions of that were difficult. But what I did understand was something that I wanted to share with everybody about love. And, somebody taught me one time, how do you spell love? And everybody would certainly start off with L, but I'll start off with T for time. T-I-M-E is how you spell love. And so until we can all start loving and spending time listening to people, we're not going to get anywhere. And what I learned was, because they're gay and I didn't know it, doesn't mean that I'm going to love them any less. It doesn't mean I'm going to love anyone any less. But as that came through to me, what I would tell you is that it hit me like a ton of bricks. I thought I was a loving person, that I was a caring person, that I wasn't prejudiced. But there's the unconscious part that you don't realize until it comes close to home. And so I'm still wrestling with it because I don't know how I'm going to talk to family members who don't know about it, people in the industry who don't know about it. And I don't know how to do that yet. So I'm working on that piece. But in the meantime, I would tell you that this advocacy and this ally component that you brought up, Rodney, I would just tell you there's another acronym, A, B, and C. And I would say first one is attend these sessions. If we don't attend these, we're not going to be enlightened. The second one is believe. The B stands for belief. Belief that we can get through this unified and together in this fitness industry. And the last one, I said it earlier, is about courage. I think that it's one thing to say you have courage, but to come out and actually talk about these things when you already know people are not for this, they're against it in many ways, but those of us that used to have unconscious bias and still do want to get better at it. And so I would just encourage people to have that courage. And a specific recommendation is October 6th in club industry from last year. Rodney, I think you were in that list. There is a plethora of articles to be read from that one issue about race. If you're not sure how to go about these things, and inclusion and diversity and equity, that I would encourage you to go there and look for that.
Thank you for that, Frank. And thank you for trusting us. And we've talked about this offline previously, trusting me to share that. I mean, I think it's a great example of the type of vulnerability that we have to be willing to demonstrate. And you can put anything in that box of that thing we're trying to work through, that thing we're trying to overcome. Yeah. But it starts with being willing to share what you really think and feel with people that can help guide you, or at least hear you out and give you an opportunity to really come to understand better what you're really feeling and what that means to you. On the topic of allyship and advocacy, what are some other perspectives? What can leaders be doing now, today? I see the finger there, Bill.
Yeah, Joella might want to go first. We haven't heard from her in a while.
Oh, I'm a good listener, just so you guys know. I'm enjoying this conversation a lot. But as far as that, yes, I'm going to be very blunt again, because that's again how I am. But I have worked for some places that didn't care. Bottom line, either they were indifferent or they just blatantly didn't care about inclusivity and diversity in the workplace and the fitness industry. I'm very fortunate, very blessed not to work for a company like that anymore, a company that does care very much and is not just being an advocate, but they're also being allies. And what we're doing at EOS is we have this platform, a panel called the Inclusivity Panel. And it's company-wide, and it's got people that work for us in every position imaginable, all ages, men, women, all ethnicities, all races, because bottom line, we're a feedback organization. And we not only care about what our members have to say, we 100% care about what our team members have to say, how they feel, what they think matters to them, what doesn't matter to them, where they think we're lacking. And that is all we're hearing voices, and we're learning a lot. That's the beauty. We're open. We want to do the right thing. So I guess my question to people out in the industry is, what kind of leader do you want to be? And more importantly, what kind of a person do you want to be? All have choices. You know, you can have a big title, make a lot of money. You know, that's all fine and great, but that doesn't matter in the long run. It matters what kind of person you truly are. So that's really where my heart is right now, and I'm very fortunate at this point.
Thank you, Joella. Bill.
Yeah. So for me, there's an issue. You know, my hair always raises on my neck when I hear somebody say, "Oh, we always just want to hire the best person," and then you go, "Well, what do the job descriptions say?" Well, you got to have a college degree or master's degree preferred. Well, where did you advertise the job? Which colleges did you go to? You know, so there's a systematic racism that we don't always think about. We think about everything in our little silo. You know, I hire the best person in front of me, but I do nothing to get diverse people in front of me. You know, I write job descriptions that are geared toward the people I know and have. I go to recruitment sources that are getting to the same people I know and have, you know, and that I'm comfortable with or familiar with. And so you can't fix it without looking at the lens of all of it. You know, when this stuff came out and I realized that certain hair products that were geared toward Black people were locked up in certain stores and white products weren't, I was mortified and embarrassed that I never knew that. When I realized that there are clear Band-Aids and white tan color Band-Aids, but there's not darker shaded Band-Aids, I was mortified and embarrassed that I never knew that, because it wasn't in my world, didn't affect me, you know? And so when you look at being an advocate, being an ally, you got to look at the global systemic situation, not just your own personal beliefs. And you got to start thinking about, what can I do to be an advocate? What can I do to be an ally? What can I do to be proactive? Because if you're not proactive, great, you can feel good. You did some more inclusiveness. You did some training. You did some awareness. Great, I feel better about myself. But if you're not proactive about some of this stuff, you're not making a real difference. And you know, maybe that awareness is a step forward, but it's not nearly enough.
Well, that's a great point. It also reminds me back to something that Lindsay mentioned earlier. I'm visualizing now this extreme, you know, the spectrum of this far side extreme and then this extreme over here. And when I think about advocacy and specifically allyship, it actually doesn't have to be this great big like thing, right? It literally can be as simple as, in that room that you're sitting in, when these conversations come up, saying, hey, by the way, we are advertising that we're an inclusive employer, but let's really evaluate where we're actually going to source, candidates to come into our organization. I would challenge us to think that, we're not as diverse or as inclusive as we think we are. And the act of bringing those things to light within those conversations, within those circles, even your immediate sphere of influence, that's actually allyship. That's more than just saying, yeah, we believe in diversity, we believe in inclusion. That's actually furthering and propagating a conversation and creating opportunities for people to learn and to become more aware. So it just really resonated with me, Lindsay, when you mentioned that, because I think a lot of folks may think I've got to go march in a protest or something in order to, show that I'm an ally. And it's not that deep.
I appreciate hearing that, because that was something I struggled with, because how can I be an ally, or how can I really help do my part? But marching and like, it didn't feel authentic to me. Like, is that the only way I can do it? Or do I have to be vocal and put it all over my social media? And I think businesses are struggling with this. And I think as an industry, I see this in my husband, he's in a different industry, but it's, his company, it's so blatantly obvious that they're doing it to check the boxes, right? We have diversity and inclusion, and it's not authentic to the company. They're doing it because the aesthetics is what they're supposed to do. And I think that is something that, if we each, I personally think, for me, what's the most important sphere of influence that I have is with my children and with my family. So it's, in conversations with them, or how we just help expose them to these things and what we teach them. And in businesses, like you said, if it's just around the conference table of, the 4 or 5 decision makers, when we're talking about, who and how to hire, that's kind of a rhetorical question. Are we doing the diversity thing because it's checking the box, or are we doing it because it's authentic and important to the fabric of who we are as a business, as a company, as an industry? And so I appreciate you bringing that up, Rodney, because that was something I personally struggled with, was, do I have to be marching in order to be an ally, or are there just as impactful ways that I can make a difference that feel authentic to me? And I think that's personal and in a business and industry-wide conversation, or question that we can ask.
Mm-hmm. Oh, really? Yes, Catherine.
Always got somebody to chime in. But I so love and appreciate what everyone said, and it's those little things that add up, right? When we're all on a million Zoom calls now, all day, every day. And when you start paying attention, you start seeing things differently. And so when I'm in a Zoom call and I hear a white person struggling over the name of a person of color, and you see the person of color doesn't want to keep correcting them, I will step in and say, no, that's not their name. Like, get it right. When you see in a room or in a meeting, men constantly cutting women off, because that happens oftentimes, women get spoken over. Stepping up and saying, I'm sorry, I don't think she got to finish her point, or let's go back to what Joella was saying, or, there's a lot of little tangible things you can do every day to lend voice where, maybe people are having those, microaggressions, or those small things that happen and kind of can cut at you. And the more you do that, I think the more other people feel empowered to do that as well. It's that Gandhi quote, and I'm going to butcher it, but, be the example you want to be, the change you want to see in the world, right? Like, if you want to see people treated differently, you have to start treating them differently yourself and be that example. And so I think the more we start to, have the conversations, raise awareness, but then also take those tiny little steps and advocate for other people, I think that's what starts to change and make other people say, like, oh yeah, maybe we should,
Catherine, just to add to that, if I may, Rodney, there is an important thing that happened to me recently, and I never heard this term, but everyone on this panel except me, Bill, and Rodney would understand manels. There's such a thing in our industry called manels. They're men on panels, and it's all men. And so I had never heard that term until just not too long ago. And then I'm thinking, I am not exclusion. I'm not excluding women on purpose, but there was no women on this panel. And it was really an eye-opening thing. And this person, who's a friend of mine in the industry, brought it to my attention. To your point, Catherine, is these small little things. And you know what she said to me? She said, well, the next time you organize one, now this was before she knew we were doing this panel, but nonetheless, the next time you organize one, maybe you'll think about it. And I thought, man, and And it was just so salient for me that it made an impact for the rest of my life. And I'm really glad that it happened.
Yeah.
So no more Manals.
Yeah, to that point, because I've been on some of those, and you fall into a trap of who do you know that knows about this, and you're moving fast. You're not slowing down and pre-planning and thinking of being aware sometimes. So a lot of this is, I mean, there's some asses out there, but there's also a lot of people that are not trying to be malicious. And that's where we get back into this stop and think about it from the other person's perspective. You're dead on.
Mm-hmm.
And I call men equally as women. Right, Frank?
That's right. Yes, you do.
So I think we've kind of come full circle in the conversation, because I think where we just left off is completely, absolutely, the perspective and the point of this whole conversation. We need perspective. We need to interrupt our patterns of behavior and be able to start to question, not completely question the fabric of our being and our lives, but at least be willing to consider that other perspectives or a different vantage point could benefit or enrich, how we see the world and how we interact with others. So in closing, this last question goes to everybody on the panel. We'll start with Joella and kind of work our way down the list. But, what closing suggestions do you have for a person, perhaps whose coworkers or leaders lack self-awareness or empathy when it comes to matters involving diversity, equity, or inclusion? How would you recommend they start?
First of all, you got to just say something. First and foremost, you just can't be afraid or hesitant to speak up in a very professional, kind way. But this stems from just kindness and empathy to a point. I know that's an overrated word, Lindsay. I agree with you on that. But we have to understand that if we do nothing changes. So, I'm even thinking, just based on the conversation today, I want diversity on my team. I mean, I crave it. Fitness, come on. The more diversity I have with men, women, Black, white, Latino, everything I want. But I was thinking to myself, even for the last two times I've hired for the position of an area manager, I didn't get any African American candidates. I didn't get any male candidates. And trust me, I want that. But now this conversation has really got me to think, well, let me figure out a different way then. Maybe I'm not looking in the right places. Maybe I'm not, listing the job posting right. So this has been very eye-opening. And I think just the leaders and that we work with and for can back and take a look inward and go, what could I do differently? Instead of just going with the status quo, the way always been, we have to look in first. It starts with us.
Thanks, Joella. Bill.
Yeah, I'll leave it with 2 points. The first thing would be, what can you do tangibly from this thing? First thing I did when all this started getting my attention in a bigger way was I did a census of my company, Active Wellness. And I had my team census every position by everything I could get data on. Male, female, race, age, if we knew about anybody with handicap issue, with disabilities, what we were doing on those fronts, because you have ageism, you have disability, you have a lot of things, right? And so I was very unhappy with my results, but I shared them with everybody on my team. We're 67% white as an organization. We're 71% female. But it drops down dramatically. We have more Hispanic than we do Black. We have more Asian than we do Black. And I look at why, and I look at where some of these health clubs are that we manage. And they're in areas where our minority percentages aren't way off of some of those communities. But Joella hit a great point. You got to be purposeful and intent. You have to have intent, right? You got to know what your situation is so you're not kidding yourself. What's your company look like? And I did it by personal training, by club, by region, all of these factors. I mean, it's a deck of about 35 slides. But now I know my circumstance and I know my markets. And there'll be markets where there's not a lot of diversity in a health club market. And you can't make it up. You might be able to recruit people and have them move in. You might be able, but you look at the membership base, you look at the community, and you look at your employee base. are they all matching up as representative of your full community? I think if you've got that from a statistical point of view, you're making some progress. At least you're not worse than the makeup of your community. But understanding your company's situation at all levels, so you know what the deal is, and looking at your community and seeing how you rate to the communities that you serve, because you want your facility to mirror your community or better in diversity. So I'll leave it with those 2 points, Rodney.
Thank you, Bill. Catherine.
When early in the pandemic, there was a group of leaders in the industry that got together, and we were trying to create a committee on DE&I, and there was a lot of genuine, authentic interest in it. And then it became, well, I've just got to keep my gym open, right? Like I've got to focus on keep my doors open. And I had a lot of discussions with a lot of people who said, who reminded me, diversity is good for business, right? And I think if we start there, that these are not either or conversations. If you're not finding support within your circle, find your allies, right? And it could be someone that looks like you, or even better, find someone that doesn't look just like you or have the same life experiences as you, and say, I'm trying to expand my worldview. I'm trying to learn more. How can I be a better ally or advocate? So find the people who can help you figure out what the next steps are. Start paying attention. Once you start paying attention, and you see the truth, it's a lot easier to call it out. Sometimes just like to Frank's point, right? Someone just saying, hey, Frank, you've got a lot of men on your panel. They didn't fix Frank's problem. They didn't change Frank. They just brought it to his attention, and then Frank can do the work, right? So for me, it's ask the questions. It's okay to be uncomfortable. We're in an industry where growth comes through discomfort, right? Like, in a yoga class, on the weight floor, growth comes and change comes from discomfort. So be a little uncomfortable, ask the questions, find your allies, and Joel, exactly to your point, be the leader that you want to be, to demand the change.
Thank you, Catherine. Lindsay.
Rodney, you recently wrote an article that actually gave me a really a good perspective of DEI for the industry. And I think, and it gave me a perspective that, for somebody, so if you're asking the question, how do you, your coworkers, your leaders, your cohorts, somebody who's not hearing it, listening it, understanding it, how do you meet them where they are? Either they're not listening because they're not ready to listen, or they don't want to listen, but how do you bring this to them in a way that meets them where they are and gets them to buy in? And even if it's like putting cheese on the broccoli, right? Like reading that article, because you positioned DE&I like really from the perspective, Catherine, you mentioned it, like, what is this? How does this actually benefit us from a business standpoint? Because now at least I capture their attention. If they're not going to listen to me from the perspective of, we really need to be looking at these because this is the socially right thing to do. If I'm not going to get them to buy in that way, maybe that eases the conversation, because now they'll look at it through the lens of, well, this, there is greater benefit. And then to me, that is like the first step to getting them to understanding the broader, but at least you're bringing them in, and it's not like a proverbially speaking, the black and white issue, right? It brings them in. So that may be a way to bring them in. And I think the other word that keeps coming up through our conversation is pause. Like, we all just need to just pause and ask different questions and ask better questions. And that sometimes requires us to step back from the everyday, because the everyday comfortable business as usual isn't changing things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lindsay. Frank.
Well, there's been a lot of great stuff, and I'm grateful to each of you guys for being on this today. I'll just finish with saying that to be an ally, you don't have to be in front of the parade. You don't have to be in front of the demonstration, but you can have those conversations to be an ally within your family, within your organization. You can be an advocate. Being an advocate gives you an opportunity to just educate yourself. And at the bare minimum, educate yourself. The world of being an ostrich and putting your head in the sand is just not good business, to Catherine's point. And to Rodney, I'm eternally grateful to you for being willing to have this conversation with me. And I love you, man, and I love this panel. It's been a great discussion. I'm glad it's not a manel either.
No, thank you, Frank. It has been. I mean, I'm going to be really blunt. Like, this was awesome. Like, just being able to have conversations like friends. We're all friends. We've known each other in many instances for a long time, but to have the opportunity just to talk about the realness of this and to validate the experiences that we've all have had. I mean, each of you have commented multiple times how you're learning from one another. As a person of color, I'm learning from this conversation, and it has my empathy muscle flexing, on a whole other level, which I think is critical for us to move forward. From my perspective, just to wrap things up, when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion for our fitness industry, it's not about demographics. It's not about percentages and ratios. It's really about what our values are, what our mission really is, and what we see as our purpose. Like, a good friend of mine, we had a conversation a few days ago, and she brought this analogy up, and it was like, bam. She's like, think about what's happened to most people in the last year with COVID and the pandemic. For a lot of people who were already isolated, they became more isolated. And they retreated into these echo chambers. And as they defriended all of their friends on Facebook because they disagreed with them politically, they retreated further and further into this space of isolation. But our industry has always been this place where people literally get to show up as they are. And you might be next to someone that is completely politically, morally, racially, all those other boxes so different from you, but you coexist in this space. And I would challenge, those watching the session today, let's get back to embracing our purpose as being that connector of diverse peoples, because we are one of the few houses where they're allowed to coexist and to have these experiences. Let's get back to connecting people. Let's get back to helping bridge those gaps, because health and wellness isn't just about lifting dumbbells and barbells and doing, cardio. It's about nurturing the spirit. So I want to say thank you to everyone for participating in today's session. This truly has been, I think, everything we hoped it would be, the continuation of this conversation. For those of you who are, on fire right now for diversity, you want to go out and have conversations, know that, we still have 2 other sessions, in this series, the next of which is a masterclass on actually starting diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And don't forget, you've also got access to our first conversation starter, also on the pages as well. With that, thank you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day. And let's keep this conversation going.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody. Great work.
Thanks, Frank.